Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to kind of go down the rabbit hole of cyber warfare.
Right.
You know, we always say that the future is now, but I think with this topic, it's like the future was yesterday.
Yeah, it's here. It's happening.
It's a little bit unnerving, honestly, to think that, battles aren't fought on, a battlefield anymore. They're fought in the digital realm. And, just the thought of like a power grid being crippled or financial systems held hostage. And it's all just through keystrokes.
Yeah, it can be a little unsettling.
Yeah, definitely unsettling. So when we talk about cyber warfare, I mean, we kind of all have this general idea of hacking and disrupting systems. But
All right.
how has this evolved beyond just, stealing military secrets or, kind of like that basic level stuff?
Well, I think the biggest way it's changed is how impactful it's become on everyday life. It's no longer just about military targets. It's about the systems that we all rely on for,
Mhm.
healthcare, transportation, communication, everything really.
So like the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia.
Exactly. That was a prime example. It wasn't just some minor inconvenience. They brought the entire country's digital infrastructure to a standstill, banks, government websites, the media, everything.
Yeah.
It was a huge wake-up call to the world about just how vulnerable nations are in the digital age.
I vaguely remember hearing about that, but it definitely didn't register as like that serious at the time. So are we talking more of these large scale attacks these days?
Oh, yeah, unfortunately. And they're getting even more audacious. I mean, just look at the SolarWinds hack back in 2020.
Right.
Attackers managed to basically insert malicious code into a piece of software that was used by thousands of organizations around the world.
Including U.S. government agencies.
Yes, including U.S. government agencies. And they were basically in the system for months, just quietly gathering intelligence before anyone even realized it.
So they weren't even trying to cause damage right away. They were playing the long game.
Exactly. They were in it for the long haul, infiltration and espionage for months under the radar.
It makes it so different from like traditional warfare. It's all about stealth and patience.
Right. And exploiting vulnerabilities that most people don't even know exist.
So that was 2020. Then just a few years later, we had the Colonial Pipeline attack in 2023.
Right. And that showed us how one ransomware attack could just completely cripple critical infrastructure. I mean, we saw fuel shortages, panic buying. It was a mess.
It's starting to feel less like a Tom Clancy novel and more like a real-life nightmare.
Yeah, it can definitely feel that way.
One question that's always bugged me, though, is how do we even know who's behind these attacks in this digital world where everyone can hide behind, layers of anonymity? It seems like tracing them back to the source would be next to impossible.
And you're right. That's one of the biggest challenges with cyber warfare. That's the attribution problem. It's like trying to solve a crime where the perpetrator used a fake ID, hired someone else to actually do the deed, and then vanished without a trace.
So it's not just about being tech savvy. It's like you got to be a master of deception.
Absolutely. Attackers are using incredibly sophisticated techniques like botnets, which are networks of infected computers to launch attacks from all over the world, making it almost impossible to pinpoint the true origin.
And then there are zero-day exploits, right?
Oh, yeah, those are nasty. Those take advantage of software flaws that haven't even been discovered yet, leaving no trace of how the attack happened.
So you're not just building digital walls, you're fighting an enemy you can't even see.
Pretty much.
That makes it really difficult to respond to these attacks. I mean, how do you retaliate or hold someone accountable if you don't even know for sure who did it?
It creates this huge level of uncertainty in international relations. A country could launch a devastating cyber attack and then just deny any involvement,
Right.
which just sows confusion and allows them to potentially avoid any consequences.
It's like a whole new kind of chess game.
It really is. And the stakes are incredibly high.
That whole difficulty and attribution, that can be weaponized. Imagine like a country crippling another country's financial markets through cyber attacks, just creating economic chaos, and then just playing dumb.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah, the targeted country is just left reeling with no way to prove who's responsible or how to respond. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase power play.
For sure.
But with nations using these tactics for political gain, I mean, shouldn't we be talking about the ethics of all this?
Yeah, you're raising a really crucial point, and one that's often overlooked. When cyber attacks target civilian infrastructure, hospitals, power grids, transportation systems, the potential for harm is huge.
Okay, so we're not just talking about military objectives anymore. We're talking about attacks that could disrupt the lives of millions of people.
Right.
That's where the ethical lines get really blurry.
Exactly, because in traditional warfare, There are at least guidelines about minimizing civilian casualties.
Right.
But in cyberspace, those lines are much harder to define, a cyber attack on a power grid, for example.
Right.
That could have cascading effects,
Yeah.
disrupting everything from hospitals to traffic lights, putting tons of lives at risk.
Yeah, so how do you even apply the traditional rules of war to something as unpredictable as a cyber attack? It's uncharted territory?
That's the problem. There's just a lack of clarity when it comes to the ethical boundaries of cyber warfare.
Hmm.
A nation could argue that a cyber attack was justified, even if it caused a lot of civilian harm, just saying it was necessary to protect national security.
It's a chilling thought. It's like we're navigating a moral minefield in this digital age.
It really is.
But if there are no clear rules, how do we prevent this from spiraling out of control?
That's where international cooperation becomes absolutely critical.
So we need some kind of global agreement on what's acceptable and what's not in cyberspace.
Exactly. We need a framework that defines cyber warfare, outlines the rules of engagement, and sets clear consequences for anyone who violates those rules.
Right.
Because without that, we're just left with a dangerous vacuum where uncertainty and mistrust are running the show.
Yeah, it doesn't sound good.
It is.
So I think we've laid out some pretty heavy stuff here.
Yeah, we have.
But this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, we've only scratched the surface.
Stay tuned. We're going to unpack a lot more of this as we continue our deep dive into the world of cyber warfare.
And that's really the crux of it. Without these clear international laws, we're kind of stuck with this question of where do we draw the line between acceptable intelligence gathering and actual acts of war in cyberspace?
That is a tough one. It's like, how do you tell if someone's just peeking through your window or actually planning to break in?
Yeah, it's a bit like that. A nation might say, hey, we're just testing your defenses, seeing how strong your security is. But those probes could easily escalate into something much more disruptive, even destructive.
So what starts as seemingly harmless reconnaissance could quickly turn into a full-blown cyber attack.
Yes, exactly. Imagine a scenario where a country gains access to another country's power grid. Maybe their initial goal is just to gather intel, to understand the vulnerabilities. But if tensions rise between those countries, that same access could be used to shut down the entire grid, causing chaos and potentially even loss of life.
Okay, so the intent might be ambiguous at first, but the consequences are very real, and that blurring of lines between espionage and warfare, it must create a lot of uncertainty and mistrust on the global stage.
Absolutely. It's like everyone's constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering what the other side is up to in the digital shadows, and that constant suspicion can lead to miscalculations and escalations, potentially sparking a conflict that no one intended.
Right. You mentioned earlier how cyber warfare is reshaping global power dynamics. Can you elaborate on that? How are we seeing this play out in the real world?
Well, for one thing, it's really leveled the playing field. In some ways, smaller nations or even non-state actors can pose a significant threat to much larger and more powerful adversaries because they don't need massive armies or expensive weapon systems to inflict real damage.
So it's not just about who has the biggest guns anymore.
Exactly. A small group of skilled hackers with the right tools and resources could cripple a nation's infrastructure or disrupt its economy. Think about terrorist organizations. They might not have traditional military might, but they can launch devastating cyber attacks that sow fear and chaos.
That's a sobering thought. It seems like cyber warfare has really changed the rules of the game when it comes to international relations, but with all this power at their fingertips, how do we hold these actors accountable, especially given how difficult it is to attribute these attacks?
Yeah, that's where things get even more complicated because the traditional laws of war, those were designed for a physical battlefield, and they just don't easily translate to the digital realm.
So are we essentially operating in a legal Wild West where anything goes?
Not entirely. There are ongoing efforts to develop international legal frameworks specifically for cyberspace, but it's a slow and complex process.
What kind of things would these legal frameworks need to address?
Well, for starters, they'd need to define what actually constitutes a cyber attack. Is it just about causing physical damage, or does it include things like data theft, election interference, the spread of disinformation?
It seems like almost every aspect of cyber warfare raises more questions than answers. It's like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by applying old rules to this new form of conflict.
And that's exactly why we need a new set of rules tailored to the unique challenges of cyberspace. These rules would need to clarify what level of response is justified in the face of a cyber attack. Can a country retaliate with a physical attack if it's the victim of a major cyber attack? And how do we protect civilians from becoming collateral damage in this digital battleground?
That last one is a big one. I mean, if a cyber attack shuts down a power grid in the middle of winter, the consequences for civilians could be devastating. It seems like there's a real moral imperative to figure out how to protect innocent people in this new era of warfare.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the need for international cooperation. No single country can solve this problem on its own. We need to work together to establish clear norms of behavior, create mechanisms for accountability, and develop strategies for deterring cyber attacks in the first place.
Okay, so let's say we manage to create these international agreements and legal frameworks. How do we actually enforce them in the digital world? It's not like you can send in troops or warships to police cyberspace.
Right, you're right. Traditional methods of enforcement don't really apply here. It's a much more complex and decentralized environment, which makes it incredibly challenging to hold actors accountable. But there are a few approaches being explored.
Like what?
One approach is what's known as naming and shaming, where countries publicly call out the perpetrators of cyber attacks.
So it's like a digital scarlet letter. You try to shame them on the global stage.
Exactly. The idea is to damage their reputation, potentially leading to diplomatic isolation or economic sanctions. There's also the possibility of retaliatory cyber attacks. If a country knows it will face a swift and devastating response in cyberspace, it might be less likely to launch an attack in the first place.
Hmm, that makes sense. But wouldn't that just lead to an escalation, a kind of digital arms race where everyone is constantly trying to one-up each other with more powerful cyber weapons?
It's a valid concern, and that's why it's so important to have those international agreements in place to establish clear boundaries and consequences. We need to move beyond this tit-for-tat mentality and create a system where cyber attacks are deterred not just by fear of retaliation, but by a shared understanding that such actions are unacceptable under international law.
Okay, so it's a complex puzzle with no easy solutions, but there are at least some efforts underway to try to create a more stable and secure cyberspace.
Yes, absolutely. And those efforts are gaining momentum. We're seeing more dialogue, more cooperation, and a growing recognition that this is a global challenge that requires a global response.
That's encouraging to hear. It sounds like there's at least some hope that we can prevent this from turning into a full-blown cyber war.
Hope is essential, but we can't afford to be naive. There will always be those who seek to exploit vulnerabilities in cyberspace for their own gain, whether it's for espionage, financial profit, or political manipulation. So while we work towards a more cooperative and secure future, we also need to be prepared for the possibility of conflict. And that means investing in our defenses, developing our capabilities, and staying vigilant.
It's amazing how this all ties together. It's not just about ones and zeros anymore. Cyber warfare has become so intertwined with like every aspect of our lives, from geopolitics to the economy, even to our personal sense of security.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not a niche issue anymore, and it's evolving so rapidly.
Mm.
One of the things that I find most concerning is in the increasing use of cyber attacks to manipulate public opinion and sow discord within societies.
Yeah, that's something we've seen play out in recent elections, right? With all the disinformation campaigns spreading like wildfire on social media.
Exactly, and it's not just about influencing elections. We're seeing these attacks used to spread propaganda, to undermine trust in institutions, even incite violence. It's like psychological warfare designed to create chaos and break down social cohesion.
So it's not just about targeting physical infrastructure or stealing data. It's about manipulating perceptions, creating narratives, and ultimately controlling how people think.
That's the really insidious thing about cyber warfare. It's often invisible, operating beneath the surface, quietly shaping the information landscapes and influencing our thoughts and beliefs without us even realizing it.
Yeah, it is unsettling to think about that our minds can basically be battlegrounds in this digital age.
It is, and it really highlights the need for critical thinking and media literacy.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of how information is being manipulated, how narratives are being constructed, and how our own biases can be exploited in the digital realm.
It seems like a pretty daunting task, though, especially with technology constantly evolving. I mean, how do we even begin to prepare for these threats when the landscape is shifting so rapidly?
So I think the first step is to acknowledge that this isn't just a technological problem, it's a human problem. We need to understand the motivations of those who engage in cyber warfare, the vulnerabilities in our own thinking, and the potential consequences of falling prey to manipulation.
So we need to invest in education and awareness, not just for cybersecurity professionals, but for everyone.
Exactly. We need to empower people to be critical consumers of information, to recognize propaganda and disinformation, and to understand how to protect themselves from manipulation. It's about building a culture of cyber awareness, where individuals are equipped with the knowledge and skills to navigate this increasingly complex digital world.
It sounds like we need a whole of society approach to cybersecurity where everyone has a role to play, from governments and corporations down to individuals.
Precisely, we need governments that invest in robust cyber defenses, that work with the private sector to secure critical infrastructure, and that cooperate internationally to establish norms of behavior in cyberspace. We need corporations that prioritize cybersecurity, that protect their data and systems and educate their employees about the threats. And we need individuals to take ownership of their own digital security, to be vigilant about the information they consume and share, and to report any suspicious activity.
You've painted a pretty stark picture of the challenges we're facing, but is there any reason for optimism? Are there any signs that we're actually making progress in addressing these threats?
There are definitely reasons for optimism. We're seeing a growing awareness of the importance of cybersecurity at all levels. Governments are investing more resources in cyber defenses, corporations are taking cybersecurity much more seriously, and individuals are becoming more savvy about the risks.
So the awareness is growing, but is that translating into concrete action?
Yes, we're starting to see some positive developments. There's increased cooperation between governments and the private sector to share information and coordinate responses to cyber threats. And we're seeing more international collaboration with countries working together to develop norms of behavior in cyberspace and to hold malicious actors accountable.
So while the threats are constantly evolving, so our responses, we're learning, adapting, and building new tools and strategies to counter these attacks.
Exactly. And it's not just about technology, it's about building resilience both at the individual and societal level. It's about fostering critical thinking, promoting media literacy, and strengthening our social fabric so that we're less susceptible to manipulation and disinformation.
It's a long road ahead, but it sounds like we're at least moving in the right direction.
We are. And remember, the future of cyber warfare isn't preordained. It's something we're actively shaping through our actions and choices.
That's an important reminder. It's not just about being passive consumers of technology, it's about taking an active role in shaping the digital world. We want to live in a world where technology is used for good, not for harm.
Well said, and that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the world of cyber warfare. We hope this has been informative and thought-provoking for you.
As always, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged, because the future of cybersecurity depends on all of us. Thanks for tuning in.